Great. Hello, everybody. Hello. Welcome. It is lovely to see you all. Good morning, afternoon, evening, even middle of the night. We've had people sometimes show up for this class. Um,
Wow.
and it is really nice to see you. I'm Rachel Scheinerman. This is My Jewish Learning TV. And we are in somewhere midway through Tractate Bava Kama. And this morning we are joined by Dr. Sarah Ronas, who's going to spend the next 30 minutes zooming us through some stuff from the last week.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Scheinerman. So as I noted it, today we are talking about Baba Kama 63 to 70, which a lot happened in. So I'll do a quick run through while I'm doing that. If you could introduce yourself in the chat, tell us where you're joining us from. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good middle of the night. When Dr. Scheinerman said that, I was extremely impressed by anyone who's joining us from the middle of the night, um, and let us know where you're coming from. So we started this week by talking about some interpretive rules, how we read biblical texts in order to derive law. Then we talked about the dangers and the benefits of self-incrimination, aka admission of guilt, and are those the same thing? Um, we spent a long time thinking about whether an item that's undergone a change is considered the same item it was before. And if so, what kinds of changes might actually change its nature? Changes of time, right? If an animal grows up, changes of name, changes of use or function, really thinking about what kinds of change an item too much, which made me wonder, what is the scientific piece? Every one of your cells repeats every 8 years, or is replaced every 8 years. Are we the same person after a certain period of time? We complicated this whole discussion by bringing in the concept of yeush, which we translate as despair, asking what if the person whose item it was gives up on the item and what that means. We talked about how we demarcate property. How do we note what belongs to who and what is not available for free use from anyone? We talked about what happens if you steal from a thief, right? What if you're not the first thief, but the second, the one who steals from the thief? And how that may or may not relate to concepts of theft and fines for theft. And a thing that kept happening, that kept striking me as I was going through, not on the day to day, but I was preparing by looking at the entire week yesterday for our conversation, was every time it seemed like we had moved away from the biblical verse in Exodus, they brought us right back. Every time I thought, okay, we've gone off on a tangent, now we're going to go in some other direction, it pulled us right back to the biblical verse in Exodus, about if you steal an animal and then slaughter or sell it, and then you get the fine, right? And it sort of highlighted for me this really interesting tension, a commitment, right, that we've seen in other discussions, but for some reason just really jumped out at me this week. And maybe it jumped out at you, I don't know. This commitment to um, being really aware of the social needs of an individual, of a community in a lived moment, while also being profoundly committed to reading every word of the biblical text and applying it carefully. Right, this tension that I saw particularly over the course of the 8 dapim that count this week inclusively. So, what I want to talk about a little bit today with you is specifically how they're reading that verse, in part because it's really interesting, and in part, I'm going to be entirely honest with you, because that's the part that confused me the most as I was learning it. And I thought, well, if I found myself having to go back at it multiple times, then maybe somebody else in the room does as well, and this could be helpful for all of us. So I'd like to share, there is in the chat here a link to the document where I have collected the various texts that I'd like us to talk about. Dr. Scheinerman, if other folks join, maybe if you could just reshare that a couple of times because they won't see it.
Would you like me to share it as my screen, or do you want to
No,
share it as yours?
I'm going to share screen.
Okay.
But I first just want to make sure folks can, if you want it, it's there. Folks who join afterwards will be able to see it. And now you should be seeing my screen. But again, if you want this bigger or smaller, you'll be able to do that yourself. And I can see that there are 22 of you who've opened it yourself, which tells me that you can at the very least see it. So wonderful. So the verse that we are talking about, there are lots of verses that we are talking about, but the one that I wanted to use as our example here is Exodus 22:3. If the theft shall be found in his possession alive, whether it is an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall pay double. Right? These are the fines for theft. And there are lots of fines for theft. We've broken out a number of fines. So in the interest of, we only have another 24 minutes, I just picked one verse, but we could have done this with a bunch of different verses. So we learn on Baba Kama 63b, the school of Rabbi Chizkiah. This is an early tradition, and they're essentially trying to understand the linguistic choices of the verse. The school of Rabbi Chizkiah taught, let the verse state only ox and theft, and everything would be included, right? If it said, if the theft shall be found, whether it's an ox or something else, the person has to pay double, right? The fine is double, full stop. So the school of Chizkiah is identifying, well, there seems to be a redundancy with listing out a donkey or a sheep. And so why is there this redundancy? Right, that's the question that the early rabbis are asking on Baba Kama 63b. Now, Rava, the next page over, is going to suggest, right, the early rabbi, the Tana, is using a particular kind of interpretive mechanism. And so let's think about that for a minute. Rava stated, when the Tana suggested, right, why do we have all these extra words? He was relying on the word alive. So he was, right, so if the theft shall be found in his possession alive. And he was saying a generalization and a detail and a generalization. Okay, so let's take a giant step back because I can see from some folks' faces we are a little confused. And to be perfectly honest, that's exactly what my face looked like when we were doing 64A. So if that's your face, no, it is also or was also my face. So he's pointing to one particular interpretive law, or maybe not law, principle. And that is the principle that when a biblical verse starts out with a generalization, right, theft, and then goes to a detail, right, let's say ox, and then goes back to a generalization, he's saying that the generalization only relates to the detail. Okay, what does that mean? Right, so in this case, what Rava is saying is, if we find the word alive, right, so if we have the generalization of theft, the detail of ox, and then the generalization of alive, then all of the right, everything in the middle, that detail of ox tells us that that we're talking about living animals, right? But living animals is the only thing that the generalization is talking about. And this is called a klal, uprat, uklal, aka a generalization, a detail, and a generalization. So using this interpretive rule of a generalization, a detail, and a generalization, the school of Chizkiah is saying we didn't need all these other animals because even the word ox would have told us we're only talking about animals. Okay. You might be wondering to yourself, okay, but we've got some problems right? Like theft and alive are not the same thing, right? It's not a say something general, offer a detail, and then say the general thing again. It's a new thing. And you might also be noticing, okay, well, the phrasing of generalization, detail, generalization assumes that the detail came in the middle of the generalizations, neither one of which is actually happening in this verse. So, Lynn, I appreciate your, and Laura, I see both of you noting maybe the order was different. It's not actually in the Hebrew. The order is the same in the Hebrew. So those questions that we just identified, right? Theft and alive are not parallel, and the order seems wrong. We are not the first to notice that. The Talmud is going to say, whoa, 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 we know the rule, and how is this being applied, right? We're going to see that right here. First comment. But the latter generalization is not similar to the first generalization. And the Gemara responds, this Tana is of the school of Rabbi Yishmael, who expounds generalizations and details in a case like this. Apparently, this Tana is from the school of Rabbi Yishmael. This early rabbi comes from a school which says that the generalizations don't actually have to be parallel. They just have to be general. Okay. And then let's talk about that order piece that you guys are noticing. Ravina said, we're going down to the next page. It's as they said in the West, in the land of Israel, any place in the Torah where you find two generalizations adjacent to each other, place the detail between them, and then treat them as a generalization and a detail and a generalization. So apparently in the land of Israel, you didn't need to have it in the order of generalization, detail, generalization in order to count it that way. As long as they were kind of close to each other, you could make it work. So the Talmud has now said the following, right? Let's take a step back because there's a lot happening here. This verse is confusing, right? It seems to have a lot of extra detail that we don't really understand why the extra detail is there. And then we have a suggestion that perhaps we need to read this as a generalization, a detail, and a generalization. Understanding that for the person doing the reading in the school of Chizkiah, the generalization, detail, and generalization don't have to be parallel, and they don't actually have to be in that order. But if they don't have to be parallel and they don't have to be in that order, then maybe we can read this text to tell us every animal out there is subject to this law. Okay. Let's keep going because we're going to pull it all together. So if you're still feeling like, I don't know if I'm in the middle of it, correct. So, all right. So far, this kind of maybe makes sense. Maybe. The Talmud's going to continue. So if so, cool. Then I have animal. I don't need anything else in the verse, right? Let's say we accept all of these principles, right? That they don't actually have to be in that order, and that the words theft and alive don't have to parallel. In that case, we still don't need all of those animals listed, right? Just the word ox should tell us all animals, right? Yes? Okay. Sorry, Dr. Scheineman, you look confused, and you're my arbiter of whether or not I'm making sense. So the Talmud's going to ask, okay, cool. Let's say I buy everything you just said, and I see from the comments, not everybody does. But if we do, why do I need sheep? Cool. I'm with you. Ox was enough. Maybe you also need donkey just to prove that it doesn't have to be a kosher animal. But oxen and sheep seem to be the same deal. So why do you need sheep? Right? That seems extra. Rather, new plan, maybe it's not a generalization, a detail, and a generalization at all. It's an amplification, a restriction, and an amplification, which is a different interpretive principle, as the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught. And in that case, right, in this principle, an amplification makes something bigger, right? A restriction makes it smaller, and then the amplification brings it big again. So in this case, the restriction is coming only to say it's everything except for what is in the middle, right? An amplification, a restriction, and an amplification I think of as an hourglass shape. right? It's everything except for this one little thing, but it's everything else. As opposed to a generalization, a detail, and a generalization, where it's not the except the stuff in the middle, it's the only the stuff in the middle. Okay. And in that case, why do we need ox, sheep, and donkey to exclude various different things? If you're still confused, don't worry. Because the next thing we're going to do is they keep talking about this guy, Rabbi Ishmael, and I want us to actually look at Rabbi Ishmael. This is from an earlier text called the Baraita de Rabbi Ishmael. And this is, those of you who use a traditional liturgy and pray every day, you may actually read this if you read the stuff at the beginning that most people skip. Many people skip. From the Baraita de Rabbi Ishmael. And Rabbi Ishmael says the Torah is expounded by 13 hermeneutical principles. Hermeneutics, as I tell my students, is just the very fancy word for interpretation. Okay? So Rabbi Ishmael says when we're trying to derive law, specifically law, when we're trying to derive law from the Torah, there are 13 rules or strategies that we can use. And just for context, other rabbis at the time offered their own lists. These lists have been grown and shrunk, etc. But I think this is sort of the classic one, and it's also the one that the Talmud is referring to. One of those rules is that classic generalization, detailed generalization, right? So we start with the generalization, we go to detail, which restricts the generalization, right? Which says the generalization is only about this one thing. And then we go back to the generalization. And another one of those rules, in at least some versions of the list, is what I'm calling this amplification, restriction, and amplification, which is more the hourglass, where the amplification is everything except the thing in the middle. Okay. So I want to go back to not screen sharing so that I can see some of your faces. Let's see if I can do that. And here I want to sort of think with you about this. I mean, so many of the comments, and I see Daniel here writing, if the reality does not match the rule, then change the reality, right? How much of this is sort of playing, and how much of this is, what's actually happening here? And I think we're so used to so often using the Torah as our rabbinic jumping off point, and then not coming back to it. And so here we just keep coming back to it. It's not a jumping off point. It's almost like I'm sort of imagining one of those kids' trampoline places where you just keep coming back to the Torah as we're learning. And so I think, one of the things that I'm thinking about as we're doing this is what are the appropriate ways to engage with the Torah in this case? And just for context, I didn't bring it all because I knew we had a limited time this morning. Another one of Rabbi Ishmael's rules is the rule of being close to something, right? So it comes right after it or right before it. Another one of his rules is the classic gezerah shava, or analogy from shared words. Another one of his rules is a kal vachomer, or from the I don't know how we're translating that, Dr. Scheinerman. It's an a fortiori argument in the fancy Latin, but from the simple to the stringent. You're muted.
Maybe from the minor to the major?
From the minor to the major. Excellent, right?
It's a tough one to translate.
Yeah. And actually in the Talmudic text, they are they go through and debate, well, maybe we should be reading this verse through an analogy. Maybe we should be reading this verse through an a fortiori argument. Maybe we should be reading this verse through the generalization, detailed generalization, right? And I think here what I take from this is two things. First, this really strong commitment to seeing the source of the ruling as the Torah, right? That the source of the ruling is the Torah. And not in this sort of performative, we gesture to Torah when we really want to be talking about something else. They keep coming back to this because these rules are from the Torah. But the other thing that we're seeing here, I think, is this very wise recognition that the Torah can be approached in at least 13 ways. And I think here of the classic expression, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? Or for those of us who've ever been to, various doctors, if you go to an orthopedic surgeon, the answer is going to be some kind of surgery, right? Right. You go, people's expertise, their one area, the thing that they know is how they see the world. And I think what we're seeing here is for the school of Rabbi Ishmael, it's less a question of we have a hammer and more a question of we have a toolbox with at least 13 tools in it, right? We may not all of us understand all 13 of those tools. Even if we say these prayers, if we read it every morning as part of our morning prayers, we may not actually know what each of them means in practice. And just for context, I say that not to be judgy. The Baraita of Rabbi Ishmael lists 13 and then goes through what each of them means and how they are applied. The piece that goes into morning prayers is just the list. So really, I mean, when I say we might be reading it and not understanding how it's applied, those are liturgical choices that have been made, probably at least somewhat in the interest of time. Right? We only have so much time in the morning before you have to get to work or make breakfast or walk the dog. So thinking here about the Torah, right, the rabbis as telling us two things. One, ultimately, when we're talking about the laws of theft and the fines around them, our baseline is the Torah. And also, part of interpreting the Torah is diagnosing what the right tool is in this case, right? What is the right tool? And what we see really from page 63 all the way into 65 for sure, maybe 66, depending on how we want to punctuate, is an extensive discussion, which is really about what is the appropriate tool in this case. We have a verse that needs to be opened, right? That needs to be opened and rules derived. Which of our various tools that the rabbis assume we are all aware of and expert in is the right one? And depending on what tool we use, we're going to come to a different outcome, which then again, as many of you are noting in the comments, leads to a question of, maybe the word of discernment, trying to figure out which outcome is the one that actually makes the most sense for our society, right? So rooting that thinking and discernment in the fact that the people who are doing the thinking and discerning are people who live in the world and feel responsible to a community, right? But that ultimately, for me, and then I can open it to questions or comments, on the one hand, I kept being like, we just keep coming back to this verse. And I'm not really sure I understand what's going on. I spent a lot of time with the Baraita of Rabbi Ishmael, just trying to figure it out, right? And on the other hand, understanding that what the rabbis are doing is actually something that so many of us do when we read sacred text, which is to say, how should I interpret this? Because if I read this with a different framework, I'm going to come to a completely different conclusion. And what's the right conclusion? What's the appropriate framework here? And they're going to come to a conclusion in this particular case. But in lots of other texts that we've read and that we're going to continue to read, they're going to come to different conclusions depending on the case. And so really thinking about how do we become expert in the whole toolbox, right? And not just be very pleased that we know how to use a hammer. And that's where I will end our conversation and open it to questions and comments and thoughts.
Thank you so much. I feel like we haven't hit that Baraita of Rabbi Ishmael in quite a long time. So it is always helpful, I think, to review it, because so often the rabbis don't say, it's rare for the rabbis to sit down and lay out their thinking about method and so forth. They just do it. They don't tell you what they're doing. So these texts where they actually step back and say, oh, this is our kit of tools. This is our toolbox and these are the things we're doing are really interesting. And of
Well,
course, I'm so glad that you noted that is not the only set, but
yes.
it is
But it is the set that they're talking about here. But even here, right, they assume you know the whole list, right? So they're not giving us the whole list. And if you look at the list in the Baraita and you look at what they're doing on these pages, they don't actually pick all 13, right? It's obvious to them some tools aren't going to work. You don't look at a nail and say, you know what I really need here is a wrench, right? So even there's a mechanism of selection. And I will say, those of you who are here this morning, you're actually getting a little bit of a preview because we're going to come back to some of these interpretive principles in about 15 pages. And so when we get there, hopefully you won't be like, whoa, what does this mean? Because we've at least got some context for it moving forward.
Do folks have questions? Could we share the 13 sometime? Nancy asks. Yes, we can share it now. I think if you scroll up, Nancy, I think there has been some discussion already in the chat. It is usually printed at the beginning of the Sifra, which is not the Talmud, but written by the same rabbis, and is a midrash, a collection of midrashim on Leviticus. So I know it's there. Is it other places as well?
It is in the morning liturgy, in a traditional liturgy, but it's a quote from
it might be in your Siddur. Here
yes,
it is.
If you have a traditional liturgy
in the Sifra, and I happen to notice there's a Wikipedia article on it too. Maybe we should have a My Jewish Learning article.
You should have a My Jewish Learning article. If only we knew someone who could make that happen.
Okay, I see. Here's the Wikipedia article. Okay, I see Carol has a hand up.
Awesome, Carol.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ronas. This is extremely helpful. It's still kind of overwhelming, but it's like going in a different door and looking at things in a different way. So I'm wondering if you think, would the rabbis, do they go through these discussions and debates to show how their own hermeneutical principle works and how good they are at using it, which is important, an important interpretive skill? Or are they more concerned about coming together and finding a collective version of practice that becomes halacha and helps the whole community? By that I mean wherever they are, Babylonia, Israel, the whole community find ways to adjudicate these problems and live together in harmony. Which one's more important?
So I want to answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a wonderful question, Carol. And I kind of want the answer to be yes, which is to say, I think those things are intertwined. A healthy community is one where we can all live together, and is one where we understand that our leaders, or those we see as our leaders, are not making stuff up, are authorized and experts in using it, right? A healthy person is one, for example, who has working, I don't know, a family member just had a hip replacement, right? This person is healthier now that they have a new hip. And so, but that only works because they went to an orthopedic surgeon who knows what the heck they're doing, right? Who didn't implant, a flower, but a new hip joint. And so thinking about how a healthy community is one where we can all live together, but part of that, right, according to these rules, but part of that is also understanding that the people who are making the rules are experts who are authorities in doing that. Now, as we've already talked about, and I think we've seen this in a number of articles, at the point when the rabbis are doing this, it's not clear that everybody in the community recognize them as leaders, right? That's a move that happens as it happens, if it happens, much later. But certainly the rabbis, I think, are profoundly committed to both a healthy community and a healthy community where it's understood that the leaders know what they're talking about and aren't just making things up. And those things are interconnected for them in a really important way. as quite frankly, I think they probably should be for all of us. That's a great question. And quite frankly, given the time, I think it's a wonderful place for us to end. So I will wish everyone a wonderful Thursday and a Shabbat Shalom and a joyous journey through the Daf this coming week.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Olson, I'm getting personal thanks for you directed to my private messages. So I wanted to say that those are coming. I see some public ones coming in as well. So everyone is appreciating your teaching. Thank you so much. Thank you for the wonderful participation, for your excellent questions and insights. And it has been a pleasure as always. And we will see you here next week. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.